At the height of the Hundred Years' War, France unleashed a secret battalion. An army of lepers promised absolution in exchange for one final mission. Wherever their carts rolled, the air reeked of decay and iron, the clatter of chains echoing like funeral bells. English soldiers fled at the sight of them, convinced the dead had risen. At dawn, on the eve of Easter in the year 1428, frost still clung to the roadside ditches, cracking under the first touch of sunlight. From the base of the St. Lazare Hill, village shepherds saw a procession making its way along the old road. It moved in silence. No singing, no shouts, no pleas for mercy. Dozens of wagons, pulled by donkeys or limping horses, creaked toward the abandoned monastery. Each cart was wrapped in black chains and rattling with armor. Lying atop them, figures that looked like corpses, but whose eyes were open. Their faces wrapped in cloth, hands bound in strips of rag. They stank of rot and incense all at once. No one from the village dared approach. Whispers spread. The king had declared war on heaven again. The bells of St. Lazare had been silent for 20 years. First came the plague, then the Black Death, then the army, and then nothing. It was said that only ghosts and vermin now lived behind those fortress walls. But that spring, the gates opened on their own, like a breath released after too long held. Inside, the walls were peeling, the towers leaning like drunken sentries. Mold clung to the altar like a shroud. Yet deep in the cellars, by the glow of oil lamps, bunks had already been prepared. Copper basins, iron shackles, bandages, charcoal, holy water, everything was ready. They didn't speak. Not one among them uttered a word. Only faint groans echoed beneath the wagon tarps as they were lifted and set on their feet. Some collapsed immediately, others leaned on rotting staves. One lost his arm. It dropped to the cobblestone with a thud. He bent down calmly, picked it up, and tucked it into his robe like a forgotten glove. Their bodies oozed with sores. Their breath was heavy, like it clawed its way out through cold dust. But their eyes, those eyes, were unervingly clear. Not human. The kind of clarity that only comes to those who no longer fear death because they've already met her. 2 hours after arrival, the first one donned a coat of mail. 2 others helped, one bracing his waist, the other fastening the straps over a rotting shoulder. The armor clanged like a mourning bell. It wasn't polished, not even whole. The plates were held together by nails and twine. But it was enough. Then came another, and another. By evening, 40 of them stood in the courtyard, each clad for battle, each holding a weapon. One gripped a hammer bound to him with chain. Another wielded a battle axe carved from blackened wood. One bore a hook in place of a sword, more executioner than knight. None moved. They stood like gravestones, until he spoke. The Archmagister of the Order of St. Lazare. Tall, gaunt, draped in a black cassock stitched with silver. His face veiled by a hood, his voice hollow as if rising from a tomb. He read from a book, Latin verses carried off by the wind. But the meaning pressed itself into the skin. He offered no blessing. He declared judgment. They were anointed in lamb's blood, then wine, then something thicker, pine and frankincense. Each stood, unflinching, even when the final mark was given, a burning cross carved into the forehead. It hissed and smoked, but none of them cried out. Only later, when the wind shifted, did the villagers hear it, singing from behind the walls. It wasn't a human choir. It was 40 voices dragged through rotting throats. A song without lyrics, only moan, step, and iron. A hymn of death, begun in hell, and heard in St. Lazare. It was no human choir. It was 40 voices dragged through rotting throats. A song with no words, only groans, footsteps, and the rasp of metal. A dirge of death, born in hell and heard in St. Lazare. That night, for the first time in 20 years, a torch burned atop the monastery tower. War hadn't struck suddenly. It crept, like a sickness, eating westward across the land, leaving behind not victories or banners, but blackened fields and scorched ruins where homes once stood. The English marched from Orleans as if following a map already traced in blood. Villages flared before their people even realized it wasn't a fire, it was a sentence. Priests were dragged from churches and forced to watch their altars smashed. Grain was spilled into the mud, ensuring no one would survive the winter. Women were taken with the same indifference shown to livestock. And after each advance, silence fell, broken only by the crunch of bones beneath boots. By then, France wasn't a country. It was a wound. Decades of war and plague had scorched it to gray ash. Its cities stank of smoke, wet wool, and the kind of fear that seeps into stone. Abandoned carts lay rotting in roadside ditches, still filled with the belongings of people who had vanished without a cry, as if erased. The king's soldiers were so hollowed by hunger and defeat, their faces had become indistinguishable, blank, slack, like corpses someone forgot to bury. They held their weapons out of habit, not strength. Their eyes carried no fire, no hope. Only exhaustion, the kind that turns men dangerous, not from courage, but from despair. And into that emptiness, into the scorched breath of war, Saint Lazare stood watching. Calm, indifferent, set apart from the roads, as if the land itself had forgotten it. The stone of its walls was old and damp, steeped in the scent of mildew and sacred oil. By day, it looked like a monastery trapped in time. But by night, from its base, came a metallic clinking, not the sound of bells, but of chains. Harsh, scraping, like someone underground dragging iron across stone. The cellars of Saint Lazare had long belonged to the Order of Saint Lazarus. It was home to those no one wanted at markets, churches, or even graveyards. Lepers. People who were followed not with pity, but with fear, as if the glance alone could infect. People given bread only by throwing it toward them, the way you toss scraps to a dog. People whose lives were considered punishment, proof that God could turn his face away. But in these cellars, they were not buried alive. They were trained. To outsiders, it must have looked like sacrilege, a cruel joke. They could barely stand. Their legs trembled even on solid ground, as if their bodies had forgotten how to bear weight. Their joints were bound with leather straps, just to lift their arms. Some of their bones crumbled at impact, dry and hollow like dust. Their fingers were wrapped in cloth soaked with fat and herbs, meant to hold the crumbling flesh together. Many no longer had true grips, just the shape of hands, haunted by the memory of holding something long since lost. And still, they were given weapons. Swords weren't placed in their hands, they were strapped on, bound with leather to what remained of wrists, like tools tied to broken branches. When they swung, there was no hiss of steel through air. Instead, came the dry rustle of bandages and the crackle of flesh beneath the straps. Each strike was not the motion of a warrior, but of someone forcing themselves to remain alive through a pain they barely felt anymore. No regular army would have accepted them. They would have been called burdens, curses, dead weight in the ranks. But the Archmagister saw something different. He saw not weakness, but something the healthy lacked, a complete absence of fear over losing their bodies, because their bodies had already been taken. He called them a choir. Not because they were beautiful or worthy of song, but because every formation, every movement, began with a grim Latin chant. It was low, muffled, like a prayer spoken from inside a grave. Not a hymn of victory, not a cry of strength, a funeral song for the living. And the longer it lasted, the more it felt as if it wasn't people training in the vaults of Saint Lazare, but something else. Something that had already crossed the line into death and come back only to learn how to kill. By the fourth day of the English siege at Saint Lazare, soldiers began waking in cold sweats. Night after night, strange sounds drifted from the monastery. No screams, no hymns. Something between a Latin mass and the screech of metal dragged across wet stone. At dawn, scouts returned with hollow eyes, avoiding their commanders. One, curled into his saddle like a frightened child, muttered about nights without faces, gaping holes instead of mouths, from which poured a sound like singing. Another described a rider, his entire body wrapped in rotting cloth, yet wearing the armor of a knight, a cross on the breastplate, inverted like a twisted version of the Hospitallers. His horse didn't trot, it floated above the ground. A third claimed he saw armor leaking black sludge, as if the metal itself were decaying. No one laughed. Except the commander, Sir William de Rouse. He was a man of numbers, not ghost stories. His army counted more than 3,000 men, with over 300 heavy cavalry. The French had no navy, no reinforcements. They were clinging to miracles, and he knew, Miracles end when fire and iron begin. At the War Council, he stated the fortress would fall by nightfall. No one argued. He even sent a rider back to York with a letter already describing the victory and the terms to come. At dawn on May 6th, the fog lay heavy but calm. The earth was soft, the wind still. And then, for the first time in days, the gates of the fortress opened. No noise, no visible movement, just the heavy wooden doors, tarnished with the fading emblem of the Order of St. Lazarus, slowly parting, like a wound splitting open. The carts came first. Not for talks, not as surrender. These carts were low, crudely built, reinforced with iron bands, not for carrying, but for containing. Seated on them were people, or what had once been people. Their bodies were bound in chains, not to keep them from escaping, but to keep them from falling apart. Their heads were wrapped in black hoods, but now and then, glimpses showed. Sunken cheeks, milky pupils, marble-like skin. They held weapons, old, rusted, but gripped with certainty. The soldiers in the front ranks recoiled. A spear clattered to the ground. One captain, whose son had died of the plague the year before, dropped to his knees and began to pray aloud. Because none of the figures made a sound, only a low, resonant hum, like something rumbling deep beneath the earth, rose from the wagons, from the bodies. And when the front lines stepped back, more emerged, those who didn't need carts. They walked on their own, however they could. Some missing arms, some missing half their faces, but they advanced with that silent, unshakable resolve seen only in those who have nowhere left to retreat. Their armor was rotted, rivets rusted, but their shields held fast. Their swords were bound to the remnants of bone with leather straps. And they moved forward, always forward. Then the battle began. The English infantry stationed at the main approach surged forward, not by command, but out of sheer instinct. To crush, to stop, to push fear back with steel. But fear does not yield to steel. When the first blows landed, no one screamed. The lepers did not react to wounds. Even when one had his leg severed, he simply collapsed to a knee, grabbed the nearest enemy, and drove a shattered halberd into his chest. No blood poured from their wounds. Only thick, gray, sticky fluid, like pus, but it didn't leak. It seemed to pull itself back inside. One soldier drove his sword straight into the chest of a shrouded knight, but the knight didn't falter. He kept walking forward, shield held high, until his own heart gave out, and the singing grew louder. It was not human. It was low, humming, relentless, a monastic chant drawn from some place beyond the living, not in praise of life, but in solemn anticipation of death. The English ranks began to waver. Strikes grew wild and erratic. One group of archers refused to fire. They claimed they didn't want the creatures to fall, because then they'd have to get closer. Commanders shouted, hammered on helmets, threatened them with the gallows. But still the lepers came, carrying with them the stench of rot, rust, decay, and incense. Their armor creaked like coffins. Their steps never hurried, never slowed. Some fell and rose again. Some lost an arm and fought with the other. They did not fight like men. They moved like a force of nature, like death itself, draped in the guise of the faithful. By midday, the puddles underfoot were no longer from rain. The English retreated to the hill, but the choir did not pursue. They halted. And then, silence. The singing stopped. No war cries, no horns, only the wind, and the slow drip of moisture from blood-soaked blades. A senior sergeant, his voice shaking, claimed he saw tears in one of their eyes. Black tears, as if they knew they were going to die, but had already died once before. The commander no longer laughed. First came the rumble. It rolled over the earth like a funeral bell swelling in its grave, echoing off the fortress walls of St. Lazare, sinking into the dark ditches below. Then it became song, monotonous, dreadful, agonizingly slow. Heavy, fractured voices drew out a Latin psalm, a hymn of judgment and blood. Those hearing it for the first time couldn't make out the words, but the meaning pressed into the skin like cold iron. It wasn't a battle cry. It was a requiem for everyone, for the living, for the dead, for those still walking the road of pain. The chant lasted until the first wave of English troops neared the northern gate. Then, as the first arrows flew over the battlements, the singing ceased. A silence fell, unnatural, like the hush in a chapel after a funeral. And then the dead advanced. No one could say who emerged first. Many wore masks. Others had their faces wrapped or hidden beneath patches of stitched leather. They moved like marionettes, broken steps, jerking motions, but always forward. Always forward. Each held whatever weapon they could grip. Rusted axes, halberd fragments, swords nailed into their palms. Their fingers didn't bend. Some fought with elbows. Others bore prosthetics fashioned from bone and steel. Behind them, the wagons followed, creaking, heavy with the dead or nearly dead. Those who couldn't walk rode, but they sang, louder than all the rest. Their rotted voices rose toward the gray sky. And for the first time in the entire campaign, the English stopped. Because they saw no army. They saw a curse. The battle began, like all battles do, with a volley. The English crossbowmen loosed the first barrage. Arrows tore into flesh, snapped necks, punched through wrappings. But none stayed down. Those who fell rose again. Those who couldn't rise crawled. One leper, with nothing left of his legs but stumps, dragged himself forward by biting into the earth. His sword was strapped to his shoulder by a leather harness. When he reached an English spearman, the man screamed as if touched by fire. The spear slipped from his grasp a moment before the rusty blade opened his chest. Blood hit the soil. And at that scream, the rest of them answered, as if fear itself had been their signal to strike. By midday, the tide had turned. The English were losing. They had expected an easy victory. By every rule of war, numbers, training, fresh supplies, weaponry, they should have crushed the fortress in under an hour. But the fortress wasn't fighting. It was the dead, not in formation, not by strategy, but as a nightmare. Soldiers who felt no pain, who did not stop when struck. One of them, a sword fused into his palm, took 4 crossbow bolts to the chest, and kept walking, trailing a black smear behind him. Half of his face was consumed by disease. But his eyes were alive. He didn't scream. He just stared. And the English soldier before him dropped his shield and ran. As the sun began to fall in the west, the English lines broke down. Officers shouted, barked orders, struck helmets with the flats of their blades. But fear doesn't obey commands, especially the kind that slips beneath armor, climbs into your throat, and dries your tongue to silence. By nightfall, men were throwing themselves into the ditches, choosing death by fall over death by touch. Many burned their banners, as if fire could erase shame. Some tried to end their own lives. One captain drove a sword into his own throat before the rotting hands could reach him. Those who couldn't die on their own died slowly, slower than mercy allows. The ditches filled quickly, first with the fallen, then with the fleeing, then with the hunted. The lepers didn't run. They walked. Always. Relentlessly. Some crawled on their bellies, leaving behind trails of pus and blood. One chronicler who fled the field later wrote from Rouen, "We did not fight men. We fought the abyss, and it won." No Englishman expected to stare death in the face and find it wore no eyes. By dawn, Brother Segrin, the last living soul in the monastery, stepped out onto the wall. He looked down at the field, where not a single French body lay. All the dead bore foreign sigils. Fog hung heavy over the trenches, thick with stench, and now and then a flicker of light would spark. A candle held by one of the lepers, kneeling and praying among the corpses as if in church. The monk lifted his gaze to the heavens. He didn't pray. He knew prayers that day would not be heard by anyone who answers. The victory at St. Lazare never made it into royal chronicles. It was not sung in legend. It did not decorate stained glass. It happened like a stain on cloth, too dark to wash out, only to be covered by another layer. First came the rumors. Then came the orders. The king, always certain of his divine anointment, understood something faster than most. This triumph could never be shown to the people. If they learned that France had been saved not by knights, not by saints or banners, but by those who had been chased with sticks and called cursed all their lives, then the illusion of order would crumble. Faith and purity would break. Every beggar and broken soul would start to believe he, too, had a right to the sword and to glory. So the king gave the command, erase them. Erase the choir. Mentions were scratched from letters, names scraped from ledgers with knives, seals broken and melted down. Couriers galloped from monastery to monastery, forcing abbots to rewrite their records, as if history itself were wax in royal hands. In Paris, scribes rewrote reports of the battle again and again, until not a breath of truth remained. The official story claimed the fortress held thanks to prayer, luck, and the discipline of its garrison. There were no lepers there. There couldn't have been. Their presence shattered the beautiful fiction in which salvation flows from the pure and the holy. Next came the slow suffocation of the Order of St. Lazarus. Not a public disgrace, no trial, no scandal, just silence, quiet, deliberate, bureaucratic death. The funding stopped as if someone had simply forgotten to sign the ledgers. The deliveries of grain and salt ceased. Shipments of linen, oil, iron gone. One morning, the fortress of St. Lazare awoke to find no one answered their letters. Even scrolls sealed with the order's crest returned unopened, as if the roads themselves had turned against them. The same people who had thanked them yesterday for salvation now turned away in the streets, pretending not to know the name. But the true erasure didn't happen in parchment. It happened at night. The victors were not rewarded. They were not sent home. They were not released back into a life they barely had left to live. They were simply removed. Like trash after a feast. Like grime after a slaughter. One by one. Those who survived the battle were hauled into the underground corridors of the fortress, into places where the walls smelled of damp stone, old lime, and medicinal herbs that no longer helped anyone. There they were kept in darkness, as if someone was trying to push them back to the place they had been dragged from by an unnatural will. And when the time came, men in white arrived for them. They were never called executioners. In royal documents, they were listed as agents of purification. Their cloaks were white, as if washed in milk. On their backs, crosses, crisp and new, the unmistakable mark of authority that could not be questioned. They moved without haste, without emotion. They did not bring panic. They brought cold. They didn't argue. They didn't persuade. They didn't speak of mercy. Their tools were clean, almost ceremonial. Ropes, oil, iron hooks, long knives meant for flesh, and torches that smelled of pine resin. The lepers were not tried. They were never officially declared guilty, because a trial would mean admitting they belonged to the law. And by the logic of that age, they did not. They were destroyed the way infected things are destroyed. They were let out in groups, sometimes 2 at a time, sometimes 5, chains ringing against stone while sick feet scraped through the dark. Some didn't even resist. They had already passed through death once and returned. They believed they had earned the right to leave with dignity. But they were not given a dignified death. Those who couldn't be killed by steel on the battlefield died from human care, from human holiness, from human fear. Their bodies were burned so the smoke would sink into the earth instead of rising into the sky. They were burned in trenches, in pits, in low places where fire burns slow and heavy, where flesh does not flare, but melts. The smell was something no one could forget, even if they had never stood there. Burning cloth, burning skin, burning bone, and over it all, incense, thrown deliberately into the flames to mask the impurity. But incense didn't mask it. It only made it worse. It turned murder into ritual. The church could not declare the unclean to be holy. It would have been blasphemy against the entire system, where illness was seen as a sentence and deformity as a mark. If lepers had become God's weapon, then God had become unpredictable. And if God was unpredictable, every sermon about punishment would crumble like clay in the rain. It was easier to declare them filth. To say their victory was not a miracle, but a temptation. Not salvation, but a trap. Not a sign of grace, but proof that the devil knew how to play on human desperation. So what happened at St. Lazare was rewritten into a different category. The category of what cannot be spoken. The category of what cannot be repeated. The category of what must be buried not only in the ground, but in memory. Their ashes were gathered and mixed with dirt, as if someone meant to strip them of shape, strip them of truth. Then they were packed beneath slabs, heavy stone slabs that absorbed years of moisture, footsteps, prayers, and fear. And on top of it all, a chapel was built. Small, quiet, nearly invisible. No rich ornamentation, no crests, no glory, only stone, a cross, and space for a single voice. Every day, a monk came there. He wasn't famous. His name entered no songs. He simply arrived and sang a psalm meant to drive the devil from the body. His voice drifted through the cold walls like smoke and sank downward into those same stones, down to where the remains of the fortress's saviors lay, sealed as forbidden truth. And if you stood there long enough, you could hear something strange. Not an echo, not the wind, not what creaking in the night, but as if a second choir, very quiet, very low, like the earth itself whispering, answered from below the stone. As if the song had never ended. As if their service had never been dismissed. As if fire had taken only flesh, but not the vow. And then it became clear. France had not simply burned its saviors. France had sealed them away along with what they had seen on the battlefield, sealed them in the hope it would never return. But dirty miracles have a habit. They don't disappear. They wait. Nearly 200 years passed, and the war that once gnawed France down to bone became nothing more than dusty pages in forgotten chronicles. St. Lazare was rebuilt. The monastery became a church. The land around it was plowed and planted with vineyards, as if memory could be turned over with the soil. But at the beginning of the 17th century, the church began to sink. One wall cracked, a thin fracture, like a wrinkle on an old face. The priests blamed dampness, time, and the weight of the roof. The locals whispered something else. Beneath the altar lay something that did not like to be sung over. The workers arrived early in the morning. At first there were ordinary sounds of repair, hammer blows, the scrape of chisels, the hoarse laughter of men tired of prayers and eager to finish their work. They lifted one slab, then another, and soon beneath the stone they found an old staircase descending into darkness, into a place untouched by daylight. The air changed immediately. Something damp and heavy rose from the earth, like rotting cloth left too long in water. The candles began to smoke, their flames trembling as if breathing through someone else's lungs. They descended, their footsteps muffled against the cold stone. There were no treasures, no gold, only darkness, flat and steady, and a ceiling low enough to press the breath from your chest. It smelled of mold and silence. And within that darkness lay what crypts are truly built to hold. Bones, stacked with such care, it could not have been by chance. 320 skulls, arranged in rows, as though someone had tried to build a choir from silence. Some of the skulls were strange, even to those who knew death. Brass plates were embedded in the bone, the metal fused into the skull as if it had taken root, like a parasite that grew inward. On some foreheads, faint impressions remained, the ghost of straps, like these heads had once worn masks, not to protect from swords, but to hide what remained of the face. In the farthest corner stood a sarcophagus. It wasn't royal. It wasn't ornate. Plain. Too plain for anyone usually entombed in stone. Carved into the lid was a cross, but its lines were crooked, twisted, as if its arms reached for something, trying to grasp the air. When the workers slid the lid aside, one of them cursed and stumbled back. There was no body. Only a book, wrapped in darkened leather and tied with a strap. The leather was coarse, like it hadn't come from an animal at all. The candlelight caught the inscription on the cover, in Old Latin. Non nobis, Domini, non nobis, sed nomini tua de gloriam. Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to your name give glory. They brought it upstairs, just an oddity at first, until the air around it began to change. The priest ordered the crypt sealed, the entrance bricked over. No one was to speak of what they had seen. But secrets live worse than corpses. Earth cannot hold them. The book ended up in the hands of a scholar in Paris, a musicologist collecting ancient liturgies, obsessed with restoring the lost hymns of the past. He believed history could not be cursed. That sound was just sound. The book contained notes, words, symbols that looked like vocal directions, not for a human choir, but for a throat no longer meant to sing. He tried to perform one hymn, at first cautiously, then louder, and something in the melody seemed to latch onto his chest from the inside. That evening, neighbors heard him singing through the walls. They said the voice didn't sound human, like it rang in two registers at once, one alive, one dead. A week later, he was found lying on the floor of his apartment, as if he had fallen asleep mid-step, a smile on his face, unnaturally calm, almost childlike. His hands and neck were covered in sores, the kind seen in those cast out of medieval towns. As if the disease hadn't come from outside, but had risen from within. From the very lines he read aloud. On the wall beside his body, one symbol had been scratched into the plaster. A cross with curved arms. Beneath it, shaky handwriting, trembling not from fear, but from awe. The order choir resumes its service. The book was locked away after that. The crypt sealed again. The altar reinforced. The crack in the wall patched. And the church stood straight once more, as if nothing had happened. But the old villagers whispered that sometimes, at night, something strange still rose from beneath the ground at St. Lazare. Not a sound you could hear with ears, but something you could feel on your skin. A song so quiet, so low, it moved not through the air, but through the stone. And no one ever opened the crypt again.